want to welcome everyone to what is our last in a series of forest-focused sessions. I erroneously, I guess in wishful thinking, announced last session that we have one tomorrow morning, but we do not. So this is the last of a series that was planned by the University of Kentucky Appalachian Center and the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network, which is a local grassroots organization working throughout the Central Appalachian region, but headquartered in Lexington, so a near neighbor to the UK Appalachian Center, actually just a few blocks down. So we're delighted to have everyone here. The title of this session is The Ginseng Commons, the Past, Present, and Future of Appalachian Root Digging and Herb Gathering. And I want to thank all our, both our convener, Mary Hufford, and also all our panelists for their willingness to go through 2 rounds of conference planning. This was planned for last year's conference, of course, which we had to cancel for the pandemic. And all of our participants today, our panelists, have been so gracious about presenting in this alternate format a year later, and I'm really thrilled to have this series of forest sessions. It's been wonderful so far, and I know today's will be as well. I want to also mention a couple of the poster sessions, particularly Chris Burney's. Chris Burney is with LIKEN, and his poster is called Sharing Successes in Forest Farming Across Central Appalachia. It's obviously closely related to this material, and that is a piece that you all could take a look at. The poster sessions are open throughout the conference. You can drop in anytime and take a look at that. Then also that's and Chris Burney's is poster 18. And then poster 13 is by Ethan Mannon of Mars Hill University. It's called An Agricultural Understory, the Farmers Federation News and Private Forest Management in Western North Carolina. So that's another one that's spot on for in terms of our discussions of forests. So and now that's our overarching. This panel is part of that larger overarching emphasis. And it is my distinct privilege to introduce today our convener, my friend and colleague, Mary Hufford, who is a visiting professor of folklore at Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, I know I'm supposed to say. And she's Associate Director of Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network. Mary grew up in the mixed mesophytic forests of southwestern Pennsylvania, and she studied forest commoning in the New Jersey pine barrens and in the coal fields of southern West Virginia. And her wonderful website, Tending the Commons, is an online exhibition based on her work with communities at the headquarters of the Big Coal River Valley, and it's featured on the Library of Congress American Memory website. And that I'll try and drop that link into the chat for those of you who are not familiar with it. It's deeply worth your time. So thank you so much, Mary, for organizing this panel as part, and Mary also played a crucial role in organizing the entire Mother Forest set of sessions. And take it away.
Thank you, Kathy. First of all, I want to say thank you to Kathy for using her position as president of the Appalachian Studies Association the year that it was slated to appear in Lexington, to leverage the forest front and center attention, and which also leveraged multidisciplinary participation and so forth. And we're so excited about what's possible going forward. I also want to disclaim the honor of having organized this session. Luc Manget actually organized this session. But I just want to say it's my pleasure to be here and to introduce this roundtable on Ginseng Commons and its speakers, with thanks to Luc for organizing the session and for the honor of inviting me to convene it. For our roundtable, I will introduce each speaker just ahead of what will be a 10-minute presentation on their work. Please use the chat function to enter questions as they arise for you. We will address those questions in turn after all the speakers have presented. About this roundtable. In the Appalachian Mountains, we find the most biologically diverse temperate zone hardwood system in the world. Its understory teems with botanicals stewarded for thousands of years by Native Americans and then by settlers from Europe and Africa, who relied on these for both home consumption and, with colonization, the global market. Among these, American ginseng has become a crucial meeting ground for local and global forest commons, one that we engage here at the crossroads of post-coal economic transitioning in a time of climate change. The connection to commons was illuminated for me in my work with coalfield communities in the southern West Virginia coalfields in the 1990s, when I realized that Seng hunting was deeply implicated in an invisible forest commons, a commons hidden in plain view, a social, cultural, and historic institution with powerful ecological, spiritual, and economic functions for land-based communities on Coal River. This roundtable convenes scholars working in history, folklore, ethnobotany, and anthropology to explore the role that ginseng and medicinal plants in general have played and continue to play in the region's economic and cultural life. Querying the future of root digging and herb gathering in the Appalachian region, we ask, what role has ginseng played in the region's history? How and why is that role changing? What are the extent and causes of decline in the region's ginseng populations? How are threats to the survival of ginseng perceived and addressed across sectors, including local communities, scientists, nonprofit organizations, buyers, public land managers, and government regulators? How does ginseng itself regenerate and renew communities of shared inquiry and stewardship? How are the fate and fortunes of ginseng entangled with the fate of Appalachian forest commons? What new spaces are being opened up for regional, epistemic, and global commoning? And to what extent might these new spaces, bright with prospects for the conservation of ginseng, signify the enclosure of the wild ginseng commons? Our first speaker, Luc Manget, is an assistant professor of history at Dalton State College in Dalton, Georgia, an expert in American environmental history and Appalachian history. Luc's forthcoming book, Root Diggers and Herb Gatherers, A Story of Commons and Capitalism in Southern Appalachia, will be published by the University Press of Kentucky in the spring of 2022. I give you Luc Manget. Please make him welcome.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Kathy, both of whom I draw extensively for my own work. So thank you for all your scholarship, and thanks for the panelists for joining me. You know, sometimes as a historian we get really kind of immersed in old times and 19th century worlds, and so it's nice to link up with people who are working in the present, and we can start thinking about the future too. It makes my work relevant to the future, you know. So I'm just going to kind of lay out a little bit about the history, about some of what my research has uncovered in terms of the role roots and herbs have played in Appalachian history. As Mary said, I'm a specialist in environmental history, so I'm interested in how nature and culture have interacted through time. But my dissertation in my book is specifically looking at root digging and herb gathering. And of course, as Mary also mentioned, root digging and herb gathering is as old as the hills. I mean, you know, we've done it for thousands of years. But my work specifically kind of looks at how it's evolved since the 18th century when global markets started opening up, and how those markets kind of interacted with local practices of root digging and herb gathering, and how they changed over time. So I'll lay out a little of that history. Try not to take too much time here, but the first big market to open up for Appalachian roots and herbs was ginseng, was American ginseng in the early 18th century, as markets with China kind of opened up, and for a long time, you know, ginseng was the lucrative herb of the forest. It was dug by Cherokee Indians and then by Euro-American settlers, African Americans, and you know, there were a few other markets that opened up in the 18th century, specifically for things like pink root and Virginia snake root, as the common name was. And ginseng, to a large degree, helped accelerate or at least bolster kind of Euro-American settlement of the Appalachian region. This is something we kind of suspected for a while, but my research has kind of shown that it was actually vital to some of these early frontier communities, especially in Western Virginia and the Ohio Valley. And there was a series of ginseng booms kind of spreading down the Appalachian spine, kind of hitting Western North Carolina a little bit later, very 1790s, early 19th century. So a big change kind of occurred in Appalachian root digging in the early 19th century, about the 1820s, 1830s, when a kind of an indigenous botanical drug trade opened up in the United States. So American medicine before that part had been heavily reliant on European medicines, some of which were plants that were imported into the United States. But around the time of the American Revolution, people started saying, hey, we need to know more about our own plants. We need to start investigating kind of the medicinal values of our own native plants. And so as the national market was kind of built in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there were these linkages, these supply chains that emerged that were kind of bringing Appalachian roots and herbs up to manufacturing centers in the north, primarily in the Northeast, but also in other places in Europe. And so a lot of my research is kind of looking at how Appalachia became the leading supplier of what they called crude botanical drugs to the emerging pharmaceutical industry. And as the pharmaceutical industry grew, those linkages kind of really strengthened. So, and you know, by the end of the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, Southern Appalachia emerged as really the center, the most important region in the country in terms of supplying Native American plants to pharmaceutical industry. And I look at some of the reasons for that, and of course, as Mary mentioned, the biodiversity, right, was first and foremost. There were so many different plants here that you could, from tropical to temperate to, that you could access a lot of different types of plants in a kind of short distance. And a lot of these early entrepreneurs were located in the Piedmont, kind of right out of the mountains, and they would buy from the mountains and then ship them up north. But also, one of the reasons it becomes so important is because of this tradition of the commons. Right? These plants were essentially harvested from the forest and could be harvested by anyone, regardless of whose property they were on. Right? So it was kind of part of the species of property that were considered the property of the harvester rather than the property of the landowner on whose they grew. And so that enabled these supply chains to reach deep in the forest and to come up with all kinds of different plants. And sometimes, there would be a bunch of one plant sold in 1 year and then it would disappear, so it offered flexibility in the supply chain to these manufacturers. And so after the Civil War, the pharmaceutical industry really boomed, and Appalachia, ramped up its production of these crude botanicals, and entrepreneurs popped up around the Piedmont and in the mountains themselves to kind of, facilitate that supply chain. So there was actually one estimate. It's hard to kind of get numbers on this sort of thing in history, but one estimate, which I think might be on the conservative end because of the source, claimed that there was about 40,000 people in Western North Carolina alone that was supplying these roots and herbs. So it was, it was a significant industry. And it was a time in which the economy of mountain communities was suffering due to this post-Civil War depression. The agricultural commodity prices were dropping. The livestock industry had been pretty much devastated during the war. So this kind of provided Appalachian people with this kind of quick source of cash that they could get from the forest commons. So the bulk of my book, I guess, will be kind of on that late 19th century boom and how it, it brought a lot of people into the woods and brought a lot of people digging for ginseng and all kinds of other plants. And that put some pressure on the commons, and it put pressure on the institution. And it led to tensions between landowners and commoners. There was a wave of laws. So there was during the like 1870s through the 19 teens, right in that time period, the root and herb commons underwent a pretty noticeable shift, a pretty noticeable renegotiation, as I call it. You know, there were more people in the woods. States, I mean, landowners were getting a little more, especially when they were eyeing the value of their timber, and they didn't want people kind of, you know, setting fires and doing things to their valuable standing timber. So they start, you know, passing laws. There was, it's a little complicated. Not all of them were targeting those commoners because of the value of their timber, but there were other concerns as well in terms of, especially conservation. There were people that were concerned that ginseng was disappearing, and that they needed to pass laws that essentially eroded that common right to ginseng. And you know, from seasons to getting permission, you know, from landowners to dig, and all those kind of came about from the 1880s to the 19 teens. You know, and ginseng gardening, ginseng cultivation starts really taking off during that time. And to make ginseng cultivation successful, a lot of the new industry during that time had to kind of physically wrest it from the commons. There was a pretty significant struggle, you know, between commoners who still treated it as property of the harvester, right, and the landowners and the gardeners who were, you know, determined to kind of assert their property rights to ginseng. And that struggle, I mean, you know, continues on, you know, to today. But I think in the it really kind of gets going in the first decades of the 20th century. And so, you know, as kind of the landscape over the course of the 20th century becomes more rationalized, right, becomes more, there were land use becomes more defined, becomes more compartmentalized. You know, how humans relate to the land becomes more strict and more rigid. The common starts eroding, and people start, you know, and it has an impact on root digging and herb gathering, and we can talk about the impact that it has at some point. But also the loss of markets. American medicine moved away from, you know, crude botanicals in medicine to start, you know, synthesizing the components of their medicines now. You know, so the loss of some of those markets had a big impact on them. You know, and at the same time, yeah, you know, I mean, conservation, some of these species just started disappearing, so it made relying on them a little more tenuous. So, you know, so that's kind of a broad, you know, overview. A lot of my research kind of goes up to about the mid 20th century. So I'm anxious to kind of hear from these people who are in the present here and see how all these kind of stories continued on.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Kate Farley, a doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Kate's research focuses on ginseng diggers and conflicts over conservation in Southern Appalachia. Kate formerly worked in environmental policy in Washington, D.C., and has a master's degree in environmental management from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Join me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you also to Kathy and Luke and all of the other panelists. I'm so excited that we're able to actually have this panel happen, even in this virtual format, even though we're not able to all see each other in person. I'm just so excited to connect with everybody else who cares so deeply about the Appalachian forests, but also Appalachian social lives and livelihoods. I'm glad I'm getting to talk a little bit about my research after Luke, because it was, you know, everything that he talked about is a really great preamble to the kind of work that I do right now with present day communities that are actively digging ginseng. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm finishing up my PhD dissertation at WashU in St. Louis. And so as a cultural anthropologist, I'm interested in how people find meaning in the world around them, and how these meaning-making processes are informing people's decisions about how they live their lives. And so most of my research on ginseng digging and growing and gathering took place between early 2019 and early 2020. I was moving back and forth mainly between Western North Carolina and Southern West Virginia, but I was working with informants in a variety of other places. And so I was interviewing ginseng diggers and growers, but I was also engaged in what we as anthropologists call participant observation. So I was going out in the woods, looking for ginseng and other forest botanicals, helping people tend or steward their patches, harvesting, spending time with diggers, shadowing them as they're making their rounds, buying ginseng. And so my work focuses on multiple dimensions of ginseng conservation and competing understandings of the human role in the more than human world. But today, though, I'm going to focus a little bit on the illegal ginseng harvesting side of things. And there's a tendency in anthropology to be sympathetic to like the little guy, the downtrodden, the David versus the Goliath kind of thing. And in this case, in Appalachia, the little guy is poor and working class rural Appalachians, some of whom dig ginseng illegally, which introduces a little bit of a problem, because how do you be sympathetic to somebody who's engaging in an activity that we all agree is causing harm to something that we deeply care about, the Appalachian forest? And so my goal is to figure out their side of the story. And then maybe we can use that as a way to help protect ginseng that doesn't cause further harm to people who have often such limited opportunities as it is. So why do people poach? And in many ways it is because of limited available opportunities. I'm sure that we're all aware of the decline of mining, timber, farming, manufacturing in the region. So fewer living wage jobs are available. And many of the remaining jobs that are available are in the service sector. So working in retail, working for local government, things like that. But not only are these jobs much less likely to pay a living wage, they're also often feminized. These jobs tend to be largely associated with women. You see a pattern where in Central and Southern Appalachia, male employment has declined while female employment has increased. But these jobs where female employment has increased are jobs where you're much less likely to make a wage that's suitable to support a family. So there's this strongly gendered aspect to it as well. But then there's also this desire for livelihoods that provide a sense of autonomy. And so you have all of this works together to create this situation where you have quite a lot of people who are making a living in partly or entirely outside of the formal economy. And ginseng digging is often just one component that will accompany other strategies. So like subsistence hunting and gardening, doing odd jobs, manual labor, buying and selling random things on, Facebook Marketplace and selling them at flea markets and that kind of thing. So this is part of a larger, complex livelihood strategy, and as we heard from Luke, ginseng digging is a tradition with a very long history in Appalachia, and people are very aware of this. That generations of rural Appalachians have dug ginseng on and off when times are hard. So you also get this sense of nostalgia for the Appalachia of the past, this sort of imaginary of the independent mountaineer. And so it enables people to basically say stuff like, oh, well, I got laid off from the mines. Nobody else will hire me. And so I'm going to do what my ancestors did to get by. At the same time, there is also this intersection of illegal ginseng digging and the opioid crisis in Appalachia. You hear this very, very common narrative of, oh, well, all of these illegal diggers are just in it for the drugs. They're just pillheads or crackheads, and they're just going to the woods to get a quick fix. Of course, anybody who's actually tried digging ginseng, it's not quick or particularly easy. So I'll just, you're not going to go and make a ton of money all at once really quickly unless you have a certain amount of long-standing, fairly intimate knowledge of the woods. But that's not to say that there isn't a strong component of the drug use problems in Appalachia intersecting with ginseng digging. For one thing, having a felony conviction or being unable to pass a drug test makes it much more difficult to secure what formal employment is available. So that further pushes people into the informal economy. And then, one of my informants in West Virginia was talking to me about he effectively launders money using ginseng. As soon as ginseng pops up early in the season, long before the legal harvest date opens, people will go out into the woods and harvest early season ginseng. We'll sell it to my informant, who I use a pseudonym. I call him Marvin in my research. We'll sell it to Marvin, and he will exchange it for a few, anything from a few joints of marijuana to a OxyContin pill or something like that. And but the value of the drugs that he exchanges is much less than the market value of the ginseng. So when the formal ginseng season opens, then he goes and pretends that he dug it all himself and sells it for much more money than the value of the drugs that he exchanged them for. And this is not an uncommon story. I have encountered quite a few people explaining to me that this is something that happens quite a bit throughout the region. At the same time, there's also a lot of people who don't entirely understand that what they're doing is wrong. There are people who will do some legal ginseng digging and then some illegal ginseng digging. As I mentioned before, it's recognized as a traditional historical practice. Often people have a much older mentor, so sometimes a blood relative, sometimes not, who taught them how to dig ginseng. So it's this oral tradition, and there's like a lot of my pawpaw Dave taught me to do it this way, so I'm going to do it this way. And even though, as Luke mentioned, it's that sense of ginseng being the property of the digger and not of the landowner. So you have people who will insist that they're digging ginseng entirely legally. But once you start talking to them more, then you learn that they're actually trespassing quite frequently in order to get access to this ginseng. And then at this, on top of all of this, there's the problem of land use change. And over the past few sessions, in this forest track here at this conference, we've been hearing about some of these changes to the Appalachian forest. We've heard about soil loss and timber harvesting and mine reclamation and forests regrowing after agriculture or other uses. And all of this is ginseng habitat loss. And then combine this with things like increased road construction for access to natural gas wells, or even ATV trails like the Hatfield-McCoy Trail Complex in Kentucky. That grants easier access to a lot of these remote forest regions that otherwise would have required somebody being fairly physically fit and having a great deal of knowledge of these forested regions without trails. But now it's, you can just hop off your ATV and dig ginseng. So it makes the access a lot easier. So there's all of these sort of broad external things that are happening. So in some ways, it sometimes feels like we're blaming these illegal ginseng diggers for a problem that has many external causes beyond just the ginseng diggers themselves. Deer, increased deer populations. That's a huge one. That's another one. So, as far as solutions go, I think that another thing that a lot of anthropologists tend to do is critique, and then never come up with a solution. But I'm trying to think of solutions. And my sense is that we need, both a carrot and a stick. And I think there's a tendency to have often just the stick part, just more regulations. People want more law enforcement, more fines, more, cops taking things more seriously. And that's the stick. But, what could the carrot be? What could the incentive be for preventing overharvesting of ginseng? So, could be something like education about other economically important forest botanicals. Luke talked about how there was a whole wide variety of different plants that people were harvesting. But now I think in a lot of areas, there's a sense of, ginseng is the only plant that people know. Maybe people know ginseng, maybe golden seal, maybe morel mushrooms. But beyond that, a lot of that plant knowledge, ramps too, but a lot of that plant knowledge has gotten lost. So perhaps some kind of, enabling people to recognize all, the diversity of other forest botanicals that are not as ecologically damaging to harvest. And then another solution that often gets brought up is, perhaps a moratorium on wild harvesting and increasing the amount of forest farmed wild simulated ginseng. And in a lot of ways, that is a really appealing solution. But I do worry that, a turn to exclusive forest farming of ginseng in combination with such a moratorium might effectively be, further enclosure of the commons, benefiting people with the land, resources, know-how to establish a forest farm and navigate the certification bureaucracy. So, how do we ensure that, these generational diggers who often don't have these kinds of resources could perhaps get access to land on which they could, legally tend or steward wild ginseng populations? So that's an overview of, sort of my research and what's been on my mind recently. And I am excited to hear everybody else's presentations, and I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll have during the Q&A portion of this session. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Not Susan. Susan's in a couple of speakers. Thank you, Kate. I really like what you were saying. As a matter of fact, as you were talking, I wrote down, we need a Green New Deal oral history project on traditional modes of engaging forest species, because those things are not just for the sake of, of putting the information in a box somewhere. It actually generates, new enthusiasm and interest and relationships. That's kind of what relationships. It's relationships.
Absolutely.
So anyway, okay. Thank you. And our next speaker is Betty Belanus. She is a curator and education specialist at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. She has curated a number of Smithsonian Folklife Festival programs and is currently working with the Smithsonian Conservation Commons toward a 2022 festival program featuring the Earth Optimism Initiative, which will include ginseng conservation as a topic. She has been directing a research and publication public program project entitled American Ginseng, Local Knowledge, Global Roots since 2018. A major product of the project will be a website featuring stories of over 50 ginseng experts with a section for others to add their own ginseng stories. So please join me in welcoming Betty Belanus.
Thanks, Mary. And Mary and I go way back as folklorists. We've both about the same, came into the discipline about the same time. So, and I have to acknowledge that our project is, like on the shoulders of giants, as they say, including Mary and all the other people here. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background on how I got into this whole ginseng thing. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about, what we're doing, what we've been doing in terms of public programming and our website and the upcoming 2022 festival. And we'll get a sneak peek of the design of the website. It hasn't been launched yet. The content is yet to be added, but the design is up, so we can see that in a little while. That's the carrot for, the stick and the carrot for what I'm going to say. Anyway, as a folklorist interested in material culture, foodways, craft, the material aspects of folklore as well as narrative, I've really been interested in herbal medicine and ethnobotany for a long time. It's been a feature of many of our past Folklife Festival programs, including a program I did in 2009 on whales, and going way back to very early Folklife festivals as well, that I didn't even have a part of, even though I've been working there for 30 years. So since about 2011, I kind of took this interest and sort of started a series of interns on some background research towards the idea of doing a whole festival program on herbal medicine and or ethnobotany. It's all kind of, combined. First we thought around the world, and then we're like, no, just in America. And then we're like narrowing it down because it's a huge field, as we know. Finally came to this idea of, well, why don't we just choose one type of herbal medicine? And I had worked in tennis projects in Tennessee. I'd worked in Indiana, in Virginia. And so I knew a little bit about ginseng and, had interviewed people who had dug it and that sort of thing. So we're like, what about ginseng? That's great. Since we're located in Washington, D.C., it's kind of like most of the, Appalachian parts of the ginseng world are within a fairly easy drive. So that's how we kind of got into it. And of course, we didn't know what we were getting into when we said, oh, ginseng, that'll narrow things down. Because as you've just heard from both Luke's work and Kate's work, the world of ginseng, the ginseng community, as I like to call it, is just like encompasses such a wide, history and culture, and so many people, both, in the Appalachian region, in Wisconsin, and in Canada, and in China and Korea, and it is really a global. There are a lot of global aspects to it, and there's so much that we don't know. So, sort of started doing field work. I recruited one of my colleagues, Arlene Reiniger, who also has worked on the festival for a long time. I said, you want to work on this with me? And she's like, sure. So we started going out and doing research in Tennessee, North Carolina, Ohio. We did go to Wisconsin, Southwestern Virginia, Western Maryland, West Virginia. So we did a lot of field trips and interviewed a number of people. And also convened some meetings, and Mary is part of our ginseng advisory, a little kind of loose advisory board, and talked to a lot of people, really casting a wide net. So when we think about ginseng, we kind of naturally think of the, maybe first the harvesters, and we've heard more about them, like Kate was just talking about. Then maybe we think about, people growing it, if we know anything about, forest, growing forest botanicals and non-timber forest products, etc. And then we may think of ginseng dealers, but then there are also a whole lot of researchers out there who are studying ginseng. For instance, in West Virginia University, Dr. James McGraw and a wide succession of graduate students and undergraduates have been, censusing ginseng in the region for over 20 years. He's just written a book, which actually is a really good book. I recommend it. It has a lot to do with the human aspects, as well as all the things that Kate was talking about are, the threats to ginseng. Anyway, so beginning around the fall of 2018, we started really, drilling down on this research. Had like I said, a lot of interns. We even did a cohort of over 20 virtual interns before virtual interns were a thing. So we wanted to bring in a lot of students that were working in the region and had an interest. So we had, a really wide and interesting variety of interns from all over the region who were, anything from conservation students to folklore students to history students to, like bringing them all together into this was really a fun kind of thing. Well, and we've, had the best of intentions of doing a lot more field research, but then the pandemic happened. So we couldn't, the Smithsonian is not, allowing us even now to go, start going out and interviewing people in person. It's not something that they're advocating or putting, allowing us to spend funds on. So we've had to pivot to some, some more remote interviewing, and but we have been able to engage people like Kate, who has been out there, some of our other former virtual interns, one from Penn State who's been working with Eric Burkhart, who's also a giant in the ginseng world. And so, you know, it's just been an incredible ride meeting all these people and finding out what they do. You know, there are also a lot of administrators that are involved in ginseng. Each state in the, region, the ginseng region has a state coordinator who also usually does something like timber as well. So it's kind of like one little part of their job, but some of them are extremely devoted to what they do. So we interviewed some of those. You know, there are park rangers, there are people like Susan, who we interviewed, who are very heavily involved in the conservation of ginseng. It's just, there's just so many people, and a lot of them know each other, but a lot of them don't know each other and don't know what, you know, other people who are working with ginseng do. So we wanted to find a way of bringing people together. I mean, our first idea, because of course we love the festival, it was to have a whole festival program on ginseng, and you could have done that, definitely, except for it takes more money than we could raise in this ginseng world, which is, you know, like not a rich world. I mean, it sounds like it is a rich world because when you look at the figures of what ginseng is sold for and, you know, how much money it makes in the long run. And but it's not, as we know. So we pivoted to thinking about, on one hand, a website that could be devoted to ginseng, and we could get some funds for, mostly from around the Smithsonian, from intra-Smithsonian funding. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But also, as Mary said, working with the Conservation Commons, which is a consortium of scientists, conservators, you know, people working at places like the Smithsonian Environmental Resource Center in Edgewater, Maryland, and other parts of the Smithsonian, to make ginseng a part of this larger initiative called Earth Optimism, which you can look that up, and they have a website. And we also have, since we haven't been able to do the festival for a couple of years, we've pivoted also to digital programming, and we were able to devote 2 of those to ginseng. Susan was on the first one, which was about women, called Women to the Rescue. I can pop those links into the chat later because they're all recorded. And Kate was part of another one that we did on ginseng dealers. And so it's just been really fun, marvelous thing to do, and we've really enjoyed it. But anyway, so I don't know how long I've been talking because I haven't kept track, but I do want to just show you, you know, a sneak peek of the website. Mary, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, you still have a few minutes.
Okay, great. So, so let me tell you a little bit about this website. We are basing it on a website, another website that one of our colleagues did called for the 50th anniversary of the festival. So it's kind of a concept that we had where she did 50 objects that we had collected during the festival, and we're like, we can do 50 people. So that's kind of the concept, is to show like a really wide variety of people that we interviewed and people that we were able to, you know, contract people to interview. So this is kind of the landing slider, which the illustrations are by a young illustrator from West Virginia. Her name is Rosalie Hazlett. She does beautiful work, and she and her sister were 2 of our virtual interns. So so we were able to, you know, work with them and actually pay her to do something. So Luke, if you want to scroll down a little bit. So there'll be this introduction, which you can read more. And all the text at this point has not been edited. So if you see something that, people have already, that we've shared it with, have already said, like, this is wrong. So it's all kind of dummy text at this point, but it's just the design. So we're going to have an introductory video, and then you scroll down from there. You have to go up and hit So then you have a grid of people that you can choose their stories. And right now, the only one that's actually filled out is Iris Gao, who is a researcher at MTSU. And you can see we've got kind of like a general location because a lot of people don't want to be, located for obvious reasons. But in this case, we have some things about Iris's work, and actually she did some creative work doing 2 quilts that featured ginseng, so we featured one of those. But anyway, so you'll be able to read about the person, their work. You get links to more information on the side if you want to read more. And there's Susan, but it's not kind of. Well, part of it is filled out. Anyway, and these are not even the final, people that are going to be in there. This is only like, for design purposes. So then the other feature is, as Mary mentioned, what's your ginseng story? You can get to it from different places, but it's a place where people can leave their own stories, and we're going to, do a big social media kind of push to and reach out to people to add their own stories. So 2 of our grants, one grant that Mary is actually working on focuses on women in ginseng, because it also, along with being kind of a very, white Appalachian dominated, it's also a male white dominated kind of field, although there are tons of women working in ginseng, and also Asian Americans, because the Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, Taiwanese Americans, all very, very involved. And Lao, Hmong, Tina Lee is Hmong, a Hmong from Wisconsin, who have worked in the industry as well. So a couple pieces, really big pieces, are missing. You will notice we don't have the Native American perspectives added yet, or the African American perspectives. It's complicated. I won't get into it, but we're working on adding more diversity to our site. Anyway, so I guess that's about all I have to say. Hopefully we'll be back on the mall in 2022. We'll be able to invite at least a handful of people involved in ginseng as part of Earth Optimism, and take it from there, I guess. Thank you. Thanks, Luke, for being the navigator.
Thank you, Betty. That was great. It was wonderful to get that sneak preview of what's coming up at the Smithsonian, and we're all very excited about being, and all of us on this session have been involved in one way or another, so it's great to see that. Our last speaker is Susan Leopold. She's an ethnobotanist and passionate defender of biodiversity. She's executive director of United Plant Savers and director of the Sacred Seeds Project, a proud member of the Patawomic. Did I say that right? I looked it up, and I looked up the pronunciation, and it was Patawomic, but I just haven't said it very much. And if you don't say it 3 times, it's yours. I mean, if you do say it 3 times, it's yours. And so I just got to say it 2 more times. Okay. The Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia. Susan is the author of Isabella's Peppermint Flower, a children's book about Virginia's botanical history. She lives on and manages a productive farm, the Indian Pipe Botanical Sanctuary, with her 3 children in Virginia, where she raises goats, peacocks, and herbs. And she's a practitioner of agroforestry, forest farming. which is also on the rise in the region. Please join me in welcoming Susan Leopold.
Whoops. Okay. There we go. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be here with everybody. I have tremendous respect for everybody here on the panel. And I hope I bring, something a little different to the discussion. I am a member of the Patawamak tribe. My aunt was a genealogist and historian. So and my grandfather, I grew up with a passion for history. The Patawamak tribe did not receive state recognition until actually 2010. So that's really interesting. A little bit, I mean, I was always kind of drawn to plants, but my encounter with ginseng really came from Andy Hankins, who was a Virginia extension agent. He came to my farm and he was very interested in specialty crops. He got me into growing cut flowers was his other passion. And fortunately, Andy had a very good connection with Larry Harding, who is a ginseng grower in Maryland, one of the few who's really tended ginseng that his father and grandfather collected from the hills of Maryland. So he is one of the few, actually the only grower I know that is growing ginseng that has been studied to be genetically identified as unique to the Maryland area. Most people who grow ginseng get their seed from Wisconsin or other areas. It takes a long time to collect ginseng from just one region and grow it to the point where you can really harvest those seeds. So anyway, you guys can all hear me okay, correct? Okay. So weird when you're sitting at a computer talking to yourself, you want to make sure everybody can hear what you're saying. So, fast forward, I've been growing ginseng on my land for, well over 20 years. And it wasn't really till about 5 or 6 years ago that I stumbled upon wild ginseng growing on my land, which was, fantastic. And what a lot of people, talk about is, ginseng is not this really showy plant you see in the wild, and actually having the ability to see wild ginseng, in the woods is a whole interesting aspect. It appears to you when it wants to be seen, and that's there's so much interesting folklore from China, and even folklore that's evolved here in Appalachia, and also from indigenous communities. It's really a spirit herb. It's a protector. It's a messenger, so all these things are really, a fascinating rabbit hole that you can go down. But I chose to plant, ginseng on my land, and I have yet to harvest it. But I do feel like it brings balance into the landscape, and it teaches you all kinds of things when you do try and grow it. Teaches you about areas where it likes to thrive, plants that it likes to grow with. All these things are really, they become a teacher of how the forest ecosystem and ecology works. I have been the director of United Plant Savers for just about a decade or so. And one of the projects that we've, pioneered along with Eric Burkhart from Penn State is the Forest Grown Verified program. And really the Forest Grown program came out of a gathering of ginseng dealers and growers who were very concerned that CITES, and this is another big component, ginseng really is an iconic plant in the history of plant conservation. It was the first medicinal plant listed on CITES, which is the Convention of International Trade of Endangered Species. So it's really a pioneering plant and conservation in a lot of respects. So as a CITES listed plant, there was concern among those that grow ginseng. And I think these are the real heroes in this story. The reason why we do have ginseng is because people plant it. So the human dynamic between people planting ginseng and preserving this species in the forest is, kind of a really important story to just digging ginseng. And I do think that to tie in the theme of the commons, I mean, that's a really incredible aspect of land use change. I think something that, maybe to add to Luke's comment was the creation of national parks. This removed people from the land. So the Great Smokies, the Shenandoah. I mean, once you removed people from the land, then they were no longer planting those seeds, but yet they knew where to go dig. Right. So the plants are getting dug, but they're not getting replanted. And that idea that nature is over here and people are over here when actually it's like this, so that's a big component to this story. But back to the forest grown program, there was concern from people who were dedicated their lives to growing ginseng on their land that they would be no longer permitted to sell their ginseng because they were selling it as wild because that's where the higher value is, and where their livelihood's going to be cut off if CITES, decided to end the trade of wild ginseng due to the increased concern over the decline in wild populations. So this is a way that growers could have their land certified that they were actually intentionally growing. And this is a really big issue. I talk a lot about this. I call it plant blindness or whatever, term you want to use. But the United States has this incredible industry of medicinal plants being harvested, but it's not acknowledged as an agricultural product. So if your ginseng's stolen, you can't claim it as stolen. It's very difficult to prosecute. I mean, all these things are really difficult. It's one thing to be a digger and go out and dig some ginseng that you find on your property or somebody else's property. It's another to dedicate your life, decades. It takes decades to grow ginseng, and then to have somebody show up and steal it all and have no repercussions. So, this is, the growers, I really want to give them a shout out. And really, growing ginseng and being a forest farmer of botanicals is something that goes back to the 1800s during the peak of the eclectic movement. The botanical trade that Luke mentioned was very much a part of rural life, and people learned how to cultivate ginseng and golden seal and many cohosh, many of these botanicals that they can then harvest from their land to support themselves. So this idea of forest farming has a long history. And what happened, as Luke mentioned, the pharmaceutical industry took over. The eclectic movement in medicine vanished, and people were not using herbs. The forest farmers stopped growing these plants. And then what happened is there was a renaissance in the herbal movement, right? And now herbs are regulated under the natural products industry as herbal supplements, and they don't, those regulations don't regulate wild harvesting or conservation of these plants. So that's, I really want to make that statement. So this is why we're having a conservation crisis when it comes to not just ginseng, but all kinds of forest botanicals. We are in the roots and barks kind of just incredible biodiversity, and it's very unique, and we need to do more to protect it. That's, a bigger topic, but back to the forest grown program. We're very excited about this program, and there's some great articles on the United Plant Savers website, in part because we see the forest grown program as a way to develop a domestic market for ginseng, right? We want people to appreciate and use this plant in a way that's sustainable and ethical to both people and the forest and the plants. And most of the ginseng market is derived from Asian consumption and Asian demand, when we really have this incredible botanical herb in our own backyard that we could be promoting for domestic market. And so we have a lot of really wonderful articles written about growing a domestic market, how to engage in the forest grown program. And, another, interesting component of that is the ginseng leaf, right? We know that the ginseng leaf has all this bioactivity. Ginseng leaf is a popular product in other markets as a tea. It's a sustainable commodity. So I think there's a lot of not just, there's certainly such a value to understanding the history, but there's a lot of economic opportunity with ginseng, looking ahead to the future. I want to highlight, I don't know how long I've been talking for, I haven't been keeping track, but I want to highlight, I think it was 3 years ago, United Plant Savers held the Ginseng and Forest Botanicals Symposium. That was the first time that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, all the ginseng coordinators in every state where ginseng can be legally certified and to be sold abroad, ginseng growers, dealers, herbalists, everybody came together and we produced an incredible symposium proceedings that is on our website. You can download it for free, read all kinds of great articles. Jim McGraw was our keynote speaker. Definitely check out his brand new book. I mean, it's amazing, 30 years of data that he's collected. And is ginseng declining? Yes. That's the simple answer. And for many reasons, but one in particular is that ginseng only has to be 5 years before it can be harvested from the wild, when we know that ginseng takes 10 to 12 years to reach sexual reproductive. But we don't have the political will to change laws and bring all these key stakeholders together to make a difference. And that's where I feel like the advocacy of United Plant Savers is really critical. And I really believe that ginseng, and hopefully the work that all of us are doing, can lead to this. It should be recognized at the federal level as a culturally, economically, and historically significant American iconic plant. And all of these agencies, from the Park Service to the Forest Service to educational institutions to nonprofits, we should all be working together, and we can make a difference. And it's going to take political will to do that. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is only going to act upon what they're told to do from the federal government. And if we, the people, don't ask the federal government to demand, that this is important, then nothing's going to change. And so that's, me on my soapbox, but I just, really honor all the work and effort of everybody. It's all so important. And I do see ginseng as a teacher. It's such an incredible legacy. And, we're so fortunate because, in my understanding, the reason why ginseng, it's so fascinating because its range is huge, right? Canada all the way to Georgia. I mean, we have this, we haven't even begun to crack the code on understanding the genetic diversity within this huge range. Now, go to the history of China, and it's like so small, the region where ginseng is native to. And that's why they wiped it out. And that's a whole nother great topic of the commons. But then you have a country like Japan, which learned how to cultivate ginseng. You have South Korea, which the government has put all this energy into. They have a thriving ginseng industry. The red ginseng that comes out of South Korea's, has a lot to be learned from. So, with that said, I think if you watch the video of the Ginseng and Forest Botanical Symposium, it's a short 5-minute video. I mean, it's just so apparent that we have this incredible plant that we collectively need to come together to ensure its future viability. And with that, it uplifts the ecology of the forest, it uplifts the cultural history of the region, and there's, all kinds of economic viability within that. So I'm really, we have a lot of resources. I want to just mention the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition. Just so much good videos on how to become a forest farmer, you know, how to get bit by what I call the ginseng virus. It's real. Once you get it, you have it forever. And it changes people's lives. People become consumed, which is good, because when you become, if you become consumed with ginseng, then you become consumed with saving the forest.
Susan, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your passion, so eloquently put forward, and your eloquent appeal. And we will. We now have about 10 minutes or more. I mean, maybe we can hang in here a little longer to address some questions that have been appearing in the chat. Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists. You've been marvelous, absolutely marvelous. What a great topic. Okay, let's move. I'm actually looking for this. Okay. What kinds of questions do we have here? Okay. Betsy Taylor asks, Luke, this is a question for Luke.
Okay.
You mentioned a change in laws in the late 19th century. Before that, did people invoke any pro-commons legal frameworks to protect the commons? Or before the 20th century, was it only customary frameworks that protected the commons?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There is no evidence that I found, no sources in which people are invoking kind of, you know, common rights to ginseng until it starts to be, you know, legislated against. You know, until it starts to be a point of debate, political debate, people aren't defending it that way. But once these laws are starting to be passed, you do see people like saying, this is my common right. God put it here in the hills. Why, you know, like they can't just like keep us out of the, you know, out of the forest, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, some of them are actually using the term commons, or at least a couple of the sources that I found from the 1870s, and that was specifically West Virginia law in 1872 that applied to just 3 counties, which was Pocahontas and Randolph and Webster, that were the top ginseng producers in the state at the time. But it required landowner permission to harvest ginseng, and so they responded by passing some resolves and sending it to the legislature and say, we'll never vote Democrat again unless you revoke this unjust law. But there's not a lot, you know.
Does anyone else have a comment on that question? That's very interesting. Okay, Kathy. Oh, let's see. That's not a question, I don't think. Oh, yeah, Kathy. Let me move.
Mary, there's a fair amount of chatter going on in the chat, but there is a hand up in the participants. I think it's Narissa. Is that right?
Oh, great. Okay, thank you for helping me see that. Well, I don't see it though. But
yeah, hang on. Let me make it to where participants can. And then Michael also has a hand up. I've got to make it so that participants can speak. They were muted upon arrival. Okay, I'm going to allow attendees
to ask questions. Yes.
Yeah, allow attendees to unmute.
Thank you. Okay, so Michael, do you want to ask your question, and then, or who's the? I don't see the other hand up.
Yeah, I think the other hand went down, but let's go with Michael then.
Okay, Michael. Michael, if you could unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, it looks like he put his question in the chat, and it looks like it was a question for me. He's asking that I briefly mentioned the relationship of ginseng with deer, and he's asking if I or anybody else could say more about that. Yeah, so basically it comes down to ginseng. Ginseng is often consumed by deer. It's not necessarily their preferred food source, but they will eat it. And deer populations have increased dramatically across the entire, all of North America, which I'm sure any of us who have spent any kind of time in rural or suburban regions with gardens have experienced this firsthand. So basically, it comes down to deer herbivory is a big problem for ginseng populations. Actually, this is something that Jim McGraw brings up in his book, that he thinks that there's this common narrative about ginseng where it doesn't come up every year. Some years it just stays dormant for the summer, and will only send up new leaves some years. And McGraw argues that this is actually not true. It does come up every year, but people are mistakenly interpreting that as staying dormant throughout the summer on certain years because it's actually being eaten by deer. I'm not necessarily certain that I agree with him on this, but I'm willing to be convinced. But regardless, deer are a problem. Deer is a problem for ginseng.
Great.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And then Narissa put her question also in the chat. And thank you, Narissa, for clarifying that. And that is, this is a question for Betty. You alluded to complications regarding the absence of Indigenous and Black stories and voices from the new Smithsonian website. Could you speak to that, please?
Sure. I'm not sure I'd call, maybe I said complications. I would say more lack of time to do more, to really do more research, and to also get the, proper permissions to interview people in the Eastern Band Cherokee and Menominee tribes, both of which have a really big role in ginseng. I think, Luke and others have certainly done some great historical, research on the uses of and the involvement of Native Americans and to some extent African Americans, but that what's going on now is kind of like the piece that's a little bit missing. And Mary, I know that your panel, which I was unfortunately not able to come to on Thursday, included Tommy Cabe, who is a forester with the Eastern Band of Cherokee. So I'm looking forward to watching that and seeing what Tommy had to say. But it's more of we have to really make a concerted effort. The African Americans, we've put a lot of feelers out there to find people who may be involved, and we've only come up with just a couple of people. I know Mary, who's doing some research for us right now, is on the trail. I think it's a complicated history. Certainly, the slave narratives of oral histories of formerly enslaved people at the Library of Congress mention. If you search for them, you get a couple of mentions of ginseng, which we kind of built one of our profiles around for the website. It's obvious that formerly enslaved people who lived in the region knew ginseng and dug it for some supplemental income when they could, before and after freedom. And there's no denying that a whole range from from Canada on down of Indian tribal people know and use ginseng. Some of that knowledge is kind of considered sacred knowledge, so it's not probably something that we would be that people may be wanting us to make public. But there's been I know part of Mary's panel was also or there was another panel, I think, on Thursday that I also missed, I'm sorry, was about the permissions that the Eastern Band Cherokee and maybe some other tribes are getting to gather, maybe not ginseng yet, but other herbs and edible forest plants that they have traditionally used out of places that are restricted for others, which of course then brings in a whole another layer of controversy. But that's why it's complicated. I guess I've made my point. We fully the beauty about our website is that we can trade people out, if you will, or we can add more people. And also we've been writing a series of articles and blogs. One of my former interns just wrote a blog about African-American uses of ginseng and hoodoo, which is great. So the knowledge is out there. We just haven't been able to tap into it as much as we would have liked to yet. So can anybody else want to speak to that? I know it's something that Kate and probably Luke and I know Susan have thought about too, as well as Mary. So I'll shut up.
Mary.
No, we are now at time for the panel, but I think we could. I would like to know if there are any more questions that people have, and I do have a question. Oh wait, here's another message coming in. Let's see. Okay, Betsy Taylor asks, ginseng is very charismatic. As important as ginseng is, are there ways in which it overshadows other botanicals and non-timber forest products that are less charismatic? That's a great question. Does anyone have an answer to that? Can ginseng be too charismatic? Charismatic to the detriment of anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just comment that that maybe ginseng gets a lot of attention, certainly because it resonates and it's been in the media and on TV shows, but actually there are so many forest botanicals that are harvested, and black cohosh being like the number 6 on the top 10 of the herbal supplements market, which is a $6 billion annual industry. Some of the other really big that we're talking about tons and tons that are harvested annually, slippery elm, black walnut shells, so there's quite a handful, and I could go on and on about the number of medicinal plants that are harvested for the natural products industry that come out of Appalachia, and certainly golden seal and a whole host of plants that are still in high demand. So maybe ginseng overshadows to some extent these other plants, but it's very much an active industry, and they're all kind of deeply linked together. And often, a dealer might want you to dig other plants if he's going to agree to buy your ginseng in the fall. Right. That's a way to, there's a lot of dynamics happening out there, trying to network in the way that ginseng plays a role in the trade, and within that you have the fur trade, and you have the recycling, and all these things are deeply linked together that kind of form that unregulated ability to make money on the side that is characteristic of the region and how people have gotten by over the years. So
Susan, can I just ask real quick? You mentioned elderberry. You're making elderberry syrup. And I've noticed in stores. I mean, just
right.
regular. I mean, it seems like elderberry's enjoyed a pretty good renaissance lately. What's the market like for that? I mean, are you selling it, or?
I mean, here's the deal. It's a great question. The majority of elderberry that is in the natural products industry comes from Europe. So that's the black elderberry. And that's in part because they just have a network of harvesters, and it's very cost effective. A lot of the elderberries are harvested, they're dried, and then they're imported into the United States. The cost of what you can buy imported elderberry in comparison to what it takes labor wise to grow, harvest, and so that's what's happening. That being said, the demand is so big that we are seeing companies, and farmers, coming into the marketplace, growing it on a large scale that can compete with the cost. And with this whole pandemic, we've seen an increase in demand in herbal products, and actually elderberries, the price is going up. It's harder to get those imported elderberries due to trade and all the restrictions that have taken place. So I think with anything, if you're growing it and making something and selling it yourself, then it's viable. But the minute you have a commodity that you want to put into the marketplace, it becomes very, very difficult. So I don't know. That was that's I hope I did okay.
Yeah, no, that was great. No, thanks. Explains a lot.
We had one more question here, and wondering about. There's two questions actually. One is, can somebody speak a bit more to the importance of ginseng leaves, to the emergence of ginseng leaves on the market, when that happened and how that's going, and secondly, deer. The topic of deer. Deer, are deer an issue for anybody trying to, not just ginseng, but somebody told me that the crop of the deer doesn't allow the seed to pass through. So but with squirrels, you're getting some, or maybe birds or whatever, you're getting avivection or what, so they're transmitting it. So if somebody could talk about leaves and deer.
I'll talk briefly, but yes, deer is a major issue, and it's not just for ginseng, it's trillium, it's all kinds of plants of the understory. We've lost the top predators. And so in that regard, yeah, it's a big issue. We need to introduce top predators. We need to do a better job managing deer populations, and it's an impact on all native plant populations. So it's a big issue. Absolutely. In regard to ginseng leaf, it has a long history of being used in herbal tea. You don't have to, a ginseng root, you have to really try to get those gissenicides out. But with ginseng leaf, it's you don't stew the leaves, you apply very little hot water, and bam. The gissenicide content in leaves are quite different and more dynamic than they are in the root. Ginseng leaf tea is a high commodity in the Asian marketplace, and some people grow ginseng really densely just to harvest the leaves and then dry them for the ginseng tea. Mountain Rose Herbs is one of the only companies that I know that is selling the forest-grown ginseng leaf, and it's time consuming to harvest and grow, but it's has a tremendous amount of potential for all kinds of applications and products.
Well,
yeah, I think Red Moon Herbs in North Carolina also does. I don't think they sell the leaf directly, but they make their ginseng tincture out of the leaf.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, at least domestically, the ginseng leaf is still a little bit of a niche market. But I think there was a comment from Jim earlier about the fresh ginseng market, or the domestic ginseng market. Yeah, and that is increasing because there's actually quite a bit of demand for fresh green ginseng, primarily from the Korean American community. So there is an increased demand for that on that side. And yeah, and actually Iris Gao, who we talked about a little bit in the context of Betty's Smithsonian website, she's done a lot of research on ginsenicide content of ginseng leaves, and she found that pound for pound, the leaf has actually something like 4 times as much than the root.
Well, then if you compare that to digging roots, you don't have to kill the plant, presumably, right? If you're harvesting the leaves. So
it just takes a lot more because leaves weigh very much.
And you want to get it at the right time of year so that you're not damaging the plant.
Right.
So it's tricky too.
Well,
I think the video I put from Mountain Rose is about some forest growers. They may talk about leaves as well as roots, I think, in that video, Susan, right? I think.
Yeah, they do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that might be something you want to watch if you're interested in that whole thing.
I think we are at the end of our time. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our producer, Kathy Newfont, and to all of the panelists, and to all of you in the audience who contributed who helped build the discussion.
Yes, thank you all. I could talk about this forever with you guys. Maybe let's keep it going.
I know, absolutely.
I know we need a 3-hour window.
All right.
Yes.
That's why I miss having, it's like, because otherwise we could just all go to lunch after this and then just
I
keep
know.
Right, right.
Sad we can't
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
That's what we would do, and we'll do that another year, Kate. We will all be at lunch at some point talking about this stuff.
And
Next year, let's hope.
I look forward to
Yeah,
let's
fingers
hope.
crossed.
I do think that the forest theme, like we need to bring it back to the ASA in an in-person. The Mother Forest theme needs to happen again somehow. We'll just stay in touch. We are going to try and build on this.
All right.
Wonderful. That's great to hear.
Good.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thanks,
You've been a
Mary.
great audience.
Bye.